Welcome to the final episode of Nest of Fearties of 2025. A lot has happened over the last 12 months. In London, the UK government continues to flounder. Despite his sizable majority, Keir Starmer has achieved the impossible. He is now the most unpopular Prime Minister in British history, more unpopular even than Boris Johnson on the day he resigned. From Andy Burnham to Wes Streeting, talk of his likely successor is endless. In Edinburgh, the result of next year's Scottish election looks like a foregone conclusion. Recent opinion polling places John Swinney's SNP at least 10 points ahead of their competitors on both regional list and constituency voting. According to Ipsos, on the former, the primary challenge does not come from Scottish Labour, as one might expect, but Reform UK, who this month won their first election north of the border in West Lothian. Today is Wednesday the 16th of December. My name is Coll McCail and I edit Scotia. Joining me on Nest of Fearties today to take stock of the year just gone are two guests who were here for our first episode back in February. Matt Kerr is a Glasgow Labour councillor and the Scotland Correspondent for the Morning Star. How are you doing?
Fair to middling.
Chris Stevens was the MP for Glasgow South West between 2015 and 2024. How are you?
I'm very well, Coll. Yes, well.
Let's get started. Less than 18 months ago, Keir Starmer won a 174-seat majority.
No, you didn't.
As we said, today he's more popular than more popular. Today he's more unpopular than any of his predecessors. Matt, what happened?
Well, I'm, as the expert on unpopularity, certainly within the Labour Party, what happened? I mean, what happened is he didn't win that 174 seat majority. I mean, that we're starting from the wrong place. There is a 174 seat majority for the Labour Party. It got that by default. I mean, I think that all the polling that occurred, if you look at the popular vote and everything, it's quite obvious. You know, the Labour vote had gone down, or was certainly was lower than it was in 2017. And what happened is they managed to get over the line in various places because basically the Tory vote stayed at home. I mean, that's not a victory. It's a farce. And so the whole thing's built on sand, electorally. But on top of all that, it's built on sand in terms of policy, in terms of ideology. I mean, I doubt you could spell the word. I mean, as he bounds up those stairs in number 10 two at a time, desperately trying, hoping to see his picture up on our wall one day, I don't think he knows why he's there of him to do that. You know, he's a really, I think he cuts a really sad figure. But the real sad thing, actually, without, I think I've made it personal enough for a moment, although I might come back to that again soon. The real sad thing is you've got a Labour government in there with that huge majority that any number of Labour governments in the past would have killed for. And what are they going to do with it? Nothing. Right? They're throwing a wee bit of money around here and there, shifting some of the deck chairs around, but is there any fundamental change taking place? No. What you're doing is you've substituted one set of managers for another. You might have different contractors from another when you look through the public services. We're not changing the ownership of the economy. We're not changing the ownership of the country. And until that happens from any government, whether it's blue, yellow, red, whatever the hell the colour is, until that happens, nothing changes in favour of working people. So, yeah, I think that's why he's unpopular, because nothing is actually improved. People's lives is not improved. There's no extra money to speak of in their pockets. There's talk about minimum wage increases and all this, but that's not really filtered through properly because of other increases in taxes. It's a joke, and it talks to me of a political world that is utterly divorced from reality and entirely focused on their own gravy train and their own careers. And not just in the here and the now, but what they're going to do when they all leave politics and they get to be jobs with the arms companies, or they get to be jobs with the private health companies. That's what these people are thinking about. They're not thinking about delivering for you and I. So apart from that, it's going well.
And the changes that have been implemented, removal of the two-child cap, for example, have been fought for tooth and nail by...
It's been drawn from them as if they were like drawing teeth. I mean, that could have been done in day one. That didn't need an announcement from the Chancellor. A budget. That could have been done at the stroke of a ministerial pen. Yeah. It's absolutely obscene that they made people wait 18 months. And incidentally, they're still waiting. It's not happened yet. It's just been announced. It's not occurred yet. So between now and April, all those hundreds of thousands of children across Britain who are suffering as a result of that absolutely fucking disgusting policy are still going to be suffering through this Christmas and through to April.
Yeah.
Because of utter cowardice. Nothing else. Sorry.
No, you're right.
Well, if somebody had their Wheaties this morning, but there's a lot of well, I'd agree with, but let's maybe take it back to the start, which I think we also mentioned in the very first episode, which is they walked in without a plan. They had a plan for the election, and the election was to squeeze as many seats as they could, which they managed to do, primarily because there wasn't a case, as Matt says, of Labour winning. It was the fact that Sunak went earlier than he was told to and advised to. He was told, wait till Farage is in America, then call the election, reform will not be a factor, and you'll have a chance. And if you go through, as some of geeks like me do, go through constituency by constituency results, there's 120 seats which Labour won, which they would not have won if Sunak had waited till Farage was in America. Because what happened was he called the election, Farage sees it coming, and then Reform build, and Reform cost the Tories a lot of seats. So then Labour walk in without a plan. They had no plan for government. They were very arrogant, a theme which we'll probably keep coming on to in this particular section. They were very arrogant in dismissing everybody else, including 4 expert groups who said that your sums don't add up, the Tory sums don't add up, and there's an 18 billion black hole. And then all of a sudden, they walk into office and they discover it's a 22 billion black hole. So, and so it's 22 plus 18, by the way, made by the fact that
What
there
does
was a
that add up to?
40 billion tax increases, which they had to do. So there's no plan. But what staggers me is that you can be in office for 18 months. Surely somebody somewhere could have said, gonna write as a plan. Somewhere, just in a wee room in a cupboard somewhere, can you please raise a plan? And they seem to be at the mercy of events rather than leading events. And it's right about the 2-child cap. Those 7 who were suspended for voting for an amendment to the King's Speech, which was an addition to the King's Speech. They didn't vote against the King's Speech. They voted to add something onto the King's Speech. And that's clearly what the terms of the SNP amendment was. Those 7 who were suspended should have received a letter of an apology, which I'm sure they won't get. But let's remember, some of them were suspended for a long period of months when they were out with the Labour Party. It would seem that those 7 have more sense and more political philosophy about them than the 400 plus who didn't, including, I would have to say, those members of Parliament representing Scottish constituencies who were writing to their constituents about why they were against the 2-child cap, why they're against the Scottish Child Payment, and there's a number of them, I would have to say. It'd be interesting to see what they're saying to those constituents, the ones that they wrote to, saying that they were against the 2-child.
You're too modest, Chris.
Well, I'm a very modest guy.
There is a particular MP who we're both familiar with, who not only supported that initial position, but actually, when Liz Kendall was speaking about her cuts to social security, he stood up behind her. He was carefully sitting behind her so he could appear in the donut and appear on the telly, and he stood up and told her how wonderful she was. I mean, that does tell you something about, so representing a constituency where a third of the people in it are in some way in receipt of support from the social security system.
And it gets back to
you stand up and you say they're getting too much.
It gets back to your initial question about the finger narrative, because I'm sure if you were to poll Piles versus the Labour Party, I think Piles would have a good chance of winning. And it's because they walked in, one of their first announcements was removing winter fuel.
Specific ailment, but
removing winter fuel from pensioners. So you're attacking your base incredibly. Yeah. And then the cuts to disability, and there were cuts to disability. They might have reversed some of them as vis-a-vis PIP, but they removed there's clear cuts to universal credit for disabled claimants.
Well, the point is, even as they rode back on a few of those things, not all of them, they're quite right, Chris, but the point is, in the process of all of that, they put forward all these fantastic moral arguments for making people poorer.
Yes.
And it was a beautiful thing to behold. people who deign to call themselves democratic socialists. It's actually
Make Britain
it's
Work
hilarious
group.
in some ways if it wasn't actually killing people.
Yeah.
Anyway.
This is interesting because it's funny, Chris mentioned that there's no one with a plan for the Labour Party and no one wrote a plan on their way into office. But there is one man and one faction within the party who have been widely touted as in the ascendancy, and that's Blue Labour and Maurice Glassman. And the plan seems to be rearmament.
Baron Glassman.
The plan seems to be rearmament and social conservatism, tighter immigration controls, etc. And that's been reflected in a lot of what Starmer has said over the last 3 months. So is there a plan? Is there a clear pivot, although it's not working, towards a blue Labourite position?
To be honest with you, I mean, Glassman certainly has a plan. And I'll give him this. He's at least been relatively consistent for now, nearly 2 decades on this. So he's got that going for him at the very least. But and one thing I will say for Blue Labour is that actually they at least identify some issues that the centre is not dealing with. And there is an issue, in working class communities about talking about immigration, right? But you don't deal with that by basically saying that all the nonsense, all the junk information that people have been fed through newspapers and television and for decades now, by the way, from across the political spectrum, unfortunately, from successive governments. You don't change that argument by saying, oh, by the way, they're all right with all that. So what we're going to do is just pull up the drawbridge. That is not how you deal with people's concerns about immigration. You deal with people's concerns about immigration by talking to them about it and actually trying to do your best to actually get real facts out there, rather than this nonsense.
Which is absolutely not what they've done.
It's actually been peddled more than anyone else. It's been peddled to the political centre. And I've always thought one of the strange ironies about Brexit. Immigration played its role in the background in terms of people arguing for Brexit, unfortunately. But one of the issues with that is probably the most pro-EU Prime Minister had in Tony Blair was actually the man who'd done more by a combination of hammering people seeking asylum whilst overseeing immigration, relatively high rates, growing rates of immigration at that time. He'd done more to confuse in people's minds what the reality of immigration was, even more to turn people to make people seeking refuge the bogeymen. He'd done more to scapegoat migrants. He'd done more to use them and abuse them, frankly, to undermine other workers in the economy, rather than actually bringing them in for the right reasons or allowing them to come in here and work and make a good life for themselves. That was not the motivation at any point. And so he'd done these things without. Well, if he'd done it with foresight, then he's an even more evil man than I could ever have imagined. But the irony is, of course, is where that takes us is where we are now. That's where the origins of that. It's actually from the political centre. The political centre made the ground for the political right to thrive on.
Well, this is the thing,
you don't change that narrative by agreeing with it. You have to actually at some point draw a line and say, actually, no. People coming over in boats are not evil. They're not coming over here to steal your women and your jobs. They're actually coming over here because they're desperate, because they actually want to make a decent life for themselves, like any one of us might in that same situation.
But the argument
needs to be said.
The argument that you've just made is not the argument put in response to those that come from Reform and Farage. The argument, and we've seen in recent weeks what that argument looks like, particularly in a unfortunate intervention from Zach Polanski on Question Time, which is immigration oils the wheels of the economy in Britain, and we require cheap labour to make the economy work.
But if you build it, there's an element of truth in that, by the way, that it has been used to fuel. This is the irony. You use and abuse people to fuel an economy, and then you point at them and say they're the problem. They're the reason you can't get a house. They're the reason you can't get a wage rise. This is outrageous. These are people that are coming here to work hard and make a decent life. And so what is it? Why is that a bad thing? There's abundant evidence worldwide actually that immigration is a positive thing. It's been a positive thing for I'll tell you something, it's been a positive thing for schools in Glasgow. See, there's nonsense about a third of kids in Glasgow can't speak. Now, I don't know whether that's true or false. In a sense, for me, it doesn't matter a damn. The issue is, anybody who's actually looked at the school results and all of this, places where where you actually had high placements of refugees and asylum seekers, and also areas of the city where there'd been where there's immigration, you actually saw an increase in an improvement in the results in those schools, and you saw an improvement in the results in those schools not just because there's people coming in and working hard, but the effect of them being there also drags up everyone's wages, everyone's game. This is positive for everyone. Everyone who's been there and who's been in this country for generations, as well as the people coming in. This is a positive thing, right? But, and I'm sure Chris will probably want to say, because he's no doubt had a similar experience to me. I've chapped doors in places like Nitshill and Govan and all the rest, where people are saying, my son, my daughter can't get a house. This is outrageous, and these immigrants are coming in and getting them and all this. Now, people believe that, right? And they believe it because that's the bullshit they're getting fed constantly by irresponsible politicians, by a media that doesn't seem to, want to do any sort of basic research. See, even if that were true, and it's not, by the way, even if that were true, what's the answer to that? And I've had to have this conversation with people, as I'm sure Chris has. The answer to that is build the bloody houses. Yes. The answer to that is provide people with the apprenticeship. The answer to that is actually government intervention to deal with the issue. Right? The issue isn't people coming here to work hard and contribute their talents and abilities and skills and ambitions to our economy and to our communities. The issue is that for decades, governments have abandoned communities, have retreated from communities, have left people with nothing, including housing, including community centres and all the rest of that. They've retreated from services. And until you see a reversal of that and the government expand again to actually do its job, then people are going to look for scapegoats, right? So what we need is actually politicians to stand up and tell the truth on this, but then follow it through with action. Because it's not good enough just to say, well, immigrants aren't the problem. You have to follow it through with saying, immigrants aren't the problem. And tell you what, but housing is a problem. We're going to build the bloody houses. That's what we need, and we need it desperately. And if we don't, we are on the road to fascism.
Chris?
Well, there was a lot in there. So let's start with immigration, and then please remind me to get back to whether there's a plan or not, because that then goes back to the budget. But I think that what has concerned me in the last 6 months is the number of Labour MPs, including two in particular from Scotland, one who may or may not be my successor, and the so-called mainstream media in Scotland who don't know the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee.
Yep.
And until we get back to explaining those basics to people, then the far right is going to win this argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true.
And one of the most beautiful things I saw when I was an elected representative was going to St Saviour's primary, when you two ex-Rangers players, Derek Ferguson and Gary McSwegan, running a show racism red card course, in which they beautifully put the difference
Those poor children.
Beautifully put the difference between a refugee, asylum seeker, and an economic migrant. So simple things like reading blast in the classroom. Dembele, what's he? Economic migrant, he's here to work. Now, I don't see Reform or all these politicians saying that all these players that are playing for Celtic and Rangers who are economic migrants should somehow remove themselves from the country. It'd certainly be an interesting argument if you were wanting to take that, if you wanted to take that forward. And then, of course, there was a story about Rudy Vata, who was an asylum seeker, who was playing for Albania. He faked an injury at half-time. He was in the Parc des Princes. He stayed in the dressing room, left through a window, and claimed asylum in France at the police station across the road from the stadium. Beautiful story. So we have to get back to this, and it really frustrates me. And I was absolutely fizzing at the time. In fact, I'm sure I was messaging Mark, but I'm absolutely furious about the complete lack of understanding between an asylum seeker and a refugee. And it goes back to the conversations where people out there do believe that asylum seekers are getting houses before other people. And that's just nonsense, because, as Matt knows, because he was a councillor when this happened, that the Home Office, in its wisdom, decided to outsource the asylum accommodation away from local authorities into the hands of multinational companies, who then drove the standards through the floor.
Yep.
When I was picking up some of the most horrific cases of where they were putting people, and all they were interested in was profit. And basically, you put to them, in Scotland, there's the Scottish Quality Housing Standards. Home Office don't recognise that as a Home Office contract. We can go by their rules. All that sort of stuff. Absolutely, completely and utterly outrageous. What Serco in particular were up to, and the number of exchanges I had with Rupert Soames, who I see is now president of the CBI currently. So all this stuff about big business are good people, very good. But there was
I've never heard anyone say that.
a number of like the Tories used to tell me all these things. I mean, I remember the Tories telling me that fire rehire was not an evil practice. I remember that one, and then described why it was a bad practice, and I then had to say, so it is an evil practice, or it can be an evil practice. But anyway, let's stay with immigration. But this finger pointing has got to stop. So asylum seekers don't get houses in front villas. What's happened is, in some of the cases that I had prior to the election, is that you actually had asylum seekers in tenement properties who were then being told by the provider, we're going to take you to the Thomas Allen Centre today to get you your new house, you'll be in a new house today as a refugee, and they ended up 4 months in a hotel because the council were trying to find them property, and Govan Law Centre ended up assisting that particular constituent and making sure that he ended up getting a house.
And Serco ended up much better off in the meantime.
And they're far from alone, I mean.
They're far from alone. That is not an isolated case. And what the Home Office do, and this was thrown back at the two Labour MPs in particular, is that the Home Office and the provider dump refugees when they have that status. Welcome to the UK. We recognise your case. We recognise that you're here to keep sanctuary, without dumping you onto the council. With no discussion, they have to be far better at this. The Home Office have to sit down with local authorities right across the board, because it's not just a Glasgow issue. It's an issue right across the UK with local authorities, where they should be sitting down with local authorities and trying to manage that process better. You can't say to people, we accept your case, we accept that you're here for very good reasons, you're here for sanctuary, and so we're going to make you homeless. Completely and utterly ludicrous, because at that point, all refugees are homeless. And so when they do get a house allocated to them, it's because they're homeless. It's not because they're refugees, because they're homeless. And I don't think we should be distinguishing between anybody who's homeless. If you're homeless as far as I'm concerned. We should be finding...
it's in everyone's interest to have anybody from any origin who's homeless housed. I mean, this is really basic stuff. I mean, it should not be rocket science. I mean, to kind of take it back to the kind of, if you like, the Glassman nonsense or whatever. See, he identified an issue, that immigration issue. He's come up with the wrong. The diagnosis may have been correct in terms of it being a concern for people. His prescription is terrible. And similarly, the kind of, there's a sort of kind of nationalist type thing about that as well. About flag and all that stuff. But I mean, which I think is the solution to anything as well. But there's a thing there about about social conservatism, as they've called themselves, more generally, that I think the left is not very good at dealing with, right? And if the left is to actually try and regain the ground, it doesn't mean you concede the arguments. Like immigration being a perfect example, you don't concede the argument, but you actually have to take to the bloody field and play. You actually take part in the match. At the moment, they're just standing on the sideline saying, "Yeah, they're basically right." Yeah, and that's or even worse, actually, the left. The other parts, sections of the left, so-called, well, I've talked about the so-called left. Other sections of the left are actually just refusing to go on the field because people won't even engage with it, because everybody on there is a racist. The truth is, we cannot afford, right? None of us can afford to just let that go. We actually have to be on there, and we actually have to be in a competition of ideas. At the moment, there isn't a competition of ideas genuinely. We either not engaging, or other alleged people, leadership of the Labour Party are engaging in all the wrong ways. We, any of us who are socialists, any of us that actually give a damn about creating a better society, actually have to engage with, and and actually do the really long, hard, boring work of having conversations with people, because it's not enough just to stand up and just say you're all racists. That's a really important point to get across. And that's a challenge to us in the left. So don't get me wrong, some people you will be engaging with will be racists, right? Racists and bigots have always existed. But there's a whole load of people out there who've been swept along with this right-wing populist wave, who are actually, what they are people who've been left behind by successive governments. And it's our job as people believe in creating a better society, people actually believe in the power of governments and collective institutions to actually change the world. It's our job to actually encourage people to believe that they can do that. They can affect change through it. That they can stand together and change things in the workplace, in their councils or government, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I think we're now at a pivotal moment in terms of political discourse and discourse generally. Because there are phrases that you hear now in the streets that would have been completely and utterly unacceptable even a couple of years ago. You have two people conversing in their primary language and they're now being called out. I saw that in a cafe in Glasgow city centre a couple of months ago when two young women are conversing in their primary language and a guy criticises him for it and tells him to speak English and all the rest of it, and that nearly caused a scene. And I was just about ready to go over, but the staff sorted it, and I'm glad they did. But I think for political discourse going forward, I think we're at a pivotal stage for this reason. Matt correctly identifies that one of the reasons why the Labour Party's polling is so bad is because people don't think that things are getting better. They actually don't think that the cost of living's been dealt with. And I am great sympathy for that, because I only hear government ministers talking about the cost of living every budget round. It's an annual event. We need to start talking about the cost of living. And I think that, as Matt has correctly identified, we need to start saying to people, look, these people who are coming over, who are seeking sanctuary, who are in desperate situations, are not to blame for your electricity bill going up. They're not to blame for the lack of housing provision. They're not to blame for the fact that all the costs in the supermarkets are not, are more than increases in wages. That's what we need to tackle. We need to start having this conversation of the cost of living and getting that right, because unless it happens, then I think it is far right populism is going to continue to grow. Because what we have to do is we have to reduce reform back down to the racists. But it's not just the racists that have voted for him. It is the disaffected. It's also this part of the electorate who want to do something naughty. Let's do something naughty today, so we'll vote for reform, shake it up a wee bit. And there are people like that. And we have to acknowledge that. So I do think that all the political parties out with reform need to tackle this head on.
I think you're right. I think there's another sort of deeper point, that people have stopped believing that an end to austerity is possible, right? So if you stop believing that things can change, if you have had successive governments of both political parties who continue with the economic orthodoxy and enforce it through punitive measures, you stop believing in the possibility of an alternative. And in that scenario, it is all the easier for people like Farage to popularise a narrative which says this is the fault of people coming to our country seeking sanctuary. So the challenge is how to make people believe that an alternative is possible beyond simply telling them that X asylum seeker is not to blame for the decline of X service, which is what the left has been saying for a long time now, without much success and without many inroads.
See, successive governments have set about saying governments can't solve these problems.
Exactly.
And what's happened is basically eventually people have started to believe it. And we need to dissuade of them of that. Governments can do things. I'll give you oddly enough, tiny little praise for the Labour government. There you go. At the budget there was something got announced, and it was about rail fares, primarily down south, but it'll probably have a knock-on effect up here, I should imagine. About freezing rail fares, which for a lot of people particularly commuting in London, things like that, that will put money in their pockets, and effectively, as prices rise elsewhere. So it's not such a bad thing. But here's the thing: That is an industry that is in the process of being nationalised. It's not all there yet, but it's in the process of being. We'll set the Roscoe situation aside with the rolling stock, but the process, the operating companies are in the process of being nationalised. So the government has used its power to be able to say, no, prices are not going up. This is ours now. And yet, almost in the same breath, in talking about tackling the cost of living, the Chancellor then talked about bringing down energy prices by £150 a year by getting rid of this surcharge or levy for renewables that was added on to people's bills. Right. Now, we can argue back and forth about the usefulness of that levy. But it was interesting that the sector that was in the private sector, her solution was to take away a government levy to bring down prices. And in the bit that was in the public sector, the solution was to actually dictate the prices. Isn't that interesting? She actually let the cat out of the bag there. Yeah. If energy was actually in our control, she could set the price. In fact, she can do it now. She could do it now through Ofcom if she wanted. And actually what she should do is exactly that. And if the energy companies don't like it, and if their profits aren't hard enough, do you know what they can do? They can hand the bloody keys back. Because we built this infrastructure and we'll have it back. This is what needs to occur. She actually let the cat out of the bag there, saying, and the way they treated the public and the private sectors is instructed there. She's expecting the public sector to carry the cost of that freeze in a public sector service, publicly owned service. But also, I expected effectively the public sector to also carry the can in the private sector. Now that's ludicrous, right? Because the money raised through that levy was actually supposed to be the funding your renewables and all that, and that funding in renewables is not necessarily going down. So that is basically what's happened there. She's subsidising the profits of energy companies, and people get to go, oh, I've had £150 knocked off my door. What a crock of shit that is.
But they don't, Matt, and the reason they don't is because 1 week after the budget, Ofgem then put it up by £187, £197, and so people then say, "Well, that's gone."
Chris,
it's just a cynicism.
Maybe you have the same views. I'm a bit baffled by this concept of the price cap.
Yes,
because my idea of a cap is it's capped.
Yes,
not that it goes up every 6 months.
Yes.
I mean, that's not how caps work in any other walk of life.
It was actually one of the underreported things that happened in the first weeks of Labour coming in was there was a 10% increase in a cap, which they allowed to happen. Now, eventually they're going to have to say, or you'd have thought they've said by now, enough's enough.
It would be the best.
Don't ask regulators who don't want to regulate to regulate.
Do you know, that was another cat that got let out of the bag in that budget as well, because there was a little bit more breathing space in the budget, because inflation was lower than projected. Why was inflation lower than projected? Because energy prices had dropped a little bit. Oh, here's a thought. Hey, you could just as Chris has just described it, you could actually instruct Ofcom, because it is within the gift of ministers, that your aim is now to bring these prices down. And guess what that would do to the economy? You know, it would put money in people's pockets like that. It would actually take the foot off the throat all sorts of sections of industry that are heavily reliant on energy, like steel, which is dying on its backside, for example, all sorts of manufacturing industry across the country. And it doesn't do that.
We'll come on to that.
Isn't it remarkable?
We'll talk about deindustrialisation in a moment, but I want to wrap up on.
You want to wrap up?
But apart from that,
I want to wrap up on the UK government by asking you both whether the macro trends are such that this was unavoidable and we are in a period of decomposition politically on both the left and the right, where the parties that dominated 20th century party political politics are breaking down, and we are witnessing the delayed effects of that in Britain just now on both the right, with the rise of Reform and the demise of the Conservative Party, and on the left with an ascendant Green Party, a new left-wing party under the leadership of to be confirmed. Is party politics as we knew it breaking down? And in that,
I was wondering where you were going there with the last.
Yes, so was I.
And in that sense, was this inevitable to a degree?
No, well, excellent question. It was probably inevitable under Starmer's leadership. Now, I'm going to be generous and describe Keir Starmer's Labour Party centre-left, which I think is a generous interpretation. because it's certainly not the messages they were sending the electorate during election time. I don't think there was an inevitability about it. I actually think that the creation of your party and the Greens has come about because Starmer's Labour Party has allowed that space to develop. And because they were always playing to, as they call it, the so-called centre, they're going to have to describe that to me, because some of what they're doing I don't believe to be centrism either.
Not at all.
But I don't think it was inevitable, but it gets back to lack of planning, which, when you look at that last budget there, the process completely overshadowed the content of that budget. Will they want the increased tax? Who's leaking to who?
And the whole thing, policed by an Osborne-era body which should have no power to regulate the economy but has an iron grip on it.
Well, the first thing they should have done when that leak is used, that leak as an excuse to abolish this stupid.
Well, it's interesting that Coll is advocating the position of Kwasi Kwarteng. It's certainly interesting, because what happened, of course, when he said, "I'm not allowing the OBR near this," is that spooked the markets. We've now got the situation. The comical thing about the budget was that Starmer and Reeves have to stay, because if they're removed, it'll spook the markets. They ended that week in that position. The end of that week, that's precisely what Reeves did. She spooked the markets by having this completely unnecessary press conference, which spooked the markets.
But the concept of a government living in fear of the markets is absurd.
Well, it is, and I think that's also true, though. I think that's what Andy Burnham was trying to say when he had his
went over the top.
Well, yes, he went over the trenches. He came out the trenches. Andy Burnham was right when essentially what he was trying to say is that the bond market should not dictate government policy. But we're now in this space in which Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and I've not used the word British yet, Keir Starmer's Labour Party believe that the bond markets get a say in government economic strategy and policy is absurd, frankly, and they live in fear of them. Because whatever they say now, they're in danger of spooking them. But this gets to the point as to how long Keir's going to last. Now, everybody thought I was off my nut when I revealed in the very first episode that I had 5 charity wagers.
You will
be
notice
gone by the end of the year.
in my notes for the podcast, I've got bet with an ellipsis next to it. So do you want to update the podcast on how many charity wagers you've?
I have 5 charity wagers. I have 5 charity wagers, in which I had said in February of this year that I thought Starmer would be gone by the end of the year. I never thought it was off my nut. Now, some of them are doublers, because the consequences of when Starmer goes then decides when the next general election is going to be. So 3 of them are doublers. I think it's now inconceivable that we have now spent, the media has spent the last at least 6 weeks, probably longer, with a daily story of who's going to topple Keir Starmer. That's unsustainable to keep going for the next 5 months to the Scottish elections, the Welsh elections, and the local elections in England. That's the ones that are taking place, because Starmer's obviously cancelling some of them. I think that's completely and utterly inconceivable he stays. So it would be about in the ghoulies if he goes in January, but it would not surprise me if he goes in January. But it then goes to this, it's fairly interesting who's now on manoeuvres. It's fairly obvious that Wes, which if you're an SNP person, you've got to say yes, please. If Wes was in charge, and if that, Matt surely has to be expelled or resign at that point. But anyway, what then takes place, and then what then happens? Because I think that there's obviously going into 26, I believe Starmer will go, and whoever takes over is then going to decide the shape of the government and the Labour Party. And I think we'll obviously come to at some stage the question, which is this person, whoever takes over, has a mandate issue.
Yeah. Well, governments change leadership. It's happened up here. It's happened in the south. You know, and I mean, it's we have a parliamentary democracy. Is that issue about the mandate is, I'm not so sure. But I will say this. I mean, actually, to go back to my original comment, I don't think really Starmer has a mandate for anything, not least because he didn't offer anything, and secondly because people didn't vote for it. They voted against something else. But where we are, I mean, I suspect that the most obvious time to me would be for him to go after Holyrood, because obviously Labour are going to get absolutely horsed at that, and I'm happy to be quoted on that. There is, you know, I think it's still absolutely wild to me that there is people out there that think that Starmer is in any way in line to be First Minister. That sort of gives me a giggle, but I mean, not that I'm a fan of the present government, because I think they're just as centrist and useless as any other government. But I just don't see any. There's nothing on the horizon that says Labour is even close, even if they manage to get some sort of weird rainbow coalition together. Not even in the game. I mean, on a good day, they might come third. That is the obvious result that's going to spark a move against them. Hasn't helped me. I'm not saying the Labour Party in Scotland has covered itself in glory, but I will say this: you know, they've been done no favours at all by Keir Starmer. And it's a similar sort of story as say in Wales. I mean, Wales in some ways it's a far more dangerous prospect there, because you're potentially on the verge of reform taking office, right? Now, there's a bit of me, a bit like Chris with his hopes about West Streeting. I mean, despite the damage that would do, in my view, I mean, West Streeting premiership would be appalling for working people, and I think it would do a lot of harm. But I suppose you could take the accelerationist approach, that it might be enough to actually push people over the edge and look for something different. I mean, I suppose our best hope now in Wales is that actually when people get a look at reform in government and see how absolutely incompetent and inept they might be, and that it wakes people out of their slumber. But my great worry is that people are not getting woken out of their slumber by this. Well, they're still angry and they're still saying governments deliver bugger all, right? And I have to say that does apply up here as well. I know we'll cover it on this later, but I think there is issues here with with governments refusing to do things, telling everyone all the time that this is not government's job, ownership doesn't matter, it's what's the outcome, blah blah blah. And it's the same from housing to buses. The lot, everything always is focused on what government can't do. People strive all the way through their wee university debating clubs, all the way through to being researchers, to being parliamentarians, to being First Minister, striving with every sinew to get these desperately to get these damn positions, and then when they get there, they don't know what to do with them, because that's the end in itself. It's pathetic, and they don't want to give people the impression that governments can do things, because it might involve them actually having to think, and they'll get caught out, right? So that's the world we all inhabit right now.
Well, as we were saying earlier,
Wes is probably as great an example of that sort of process as anyone you'll ever find.
Well, he's certainly on.
He's a classic. But in a sense, to me, I think the outcome of the next leadership contest in UK level or in Scotland, there's obviously the best Scottish one running at the same time, I should imagine. Is sort of. I mean, up here, obviously, Jackie's already picked Michael Mara for the job. But there's bits
also in manoeuvres.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be manoeuvres. It's sorted. Whereas at UK level, at least there might be some token debate about the issue. But the issue isn't so much about who the person is. The issue is there going to be a change in bloody direction? Because if there isn't going to be a change in direction, from a purely Labour point of view, you're back to square one, and you're out of power in 5 years' time down south, and you're nowhere, continue to be absolutely zero, nowhere up here, right? You're an afterthought in people's minds. So at some point, somebody is going to have to actually take a step back and think, maybe we should actually start talking about doing stuff rather than tinkering about, right?
Well, speaking of tinkering about, the Scottish Parliament is today debating the Dog Theft Scotland Act, which segues us quite nicely onto what's going on in Holyrood, or the lack of anything substantial going on.
I'm against dogs getting nicked. Although there is a question about all ownership being theft, but
There we go. it does move us quite nicely onto the question of Scotland. Chris, you must be on cloud nine, as must your colleagues headed for a
No,
fifth successive victory.
Well, I'm not in cloud nine.
No, a
but
third decade
I
in
think
government.
That, I think that I have high hopes that things will be all right. But then, of course,
Is that not incredible, though? This is what I find
no,
so
I
interesting.
don't think it's incredible at all. Have you seen the opposition?
Well, precisely, right?
That's the issue, frankly.
That's the
There's
same
no-
reason that Starmer's in power.
I mean, someone actually shared this with me. So I had the privilege of being at the Govern Law Centre Christmas lunch because I'm on the board, and someone did say to me, "There's no one else," and it was quite a young person who said, "There's no one else to vote for." I'm finding that there's no one else to vote for. I'm not in cloud nine because I'm always it's always been drummed into me not to count the chickens. So, but usually what happens is, because we had this discussion a few times when we've been away, governments who are in the lead in polls a year before the election, 99 times out of 100 go on to win. And I think you're seeing that now. And that particular poll that came out last week from Ipso, I think, is devastating for anyone who believes that Anis Sarwar can be First Minister of Scotland. And it's not just the headline numbers, because they're always the headline grabbers. The question's further down. Who's most trusted to run the NHS? SNP. Which is staggering, given that Anis and Jackie keep talking about the NHS at every possible opportunity they get, because they believe that that's a way to get into power. Who's most trusted to run education? The SNP. Now, you're always going to have who's best to stand up for Scotland. There was no SNP. I think the party has serious problems. But funnily enough, it was no one else. But what amused me when I looked at the headline numbers, and I thought of you right away, Coll, was that the Greens, your good friends and comrades in the Scottish Green Party, are going to have 17 MSPs. And Coll, you must be in cloud nine that the Green Party is going to have 17 MSPs. Just think of the stories that you're going to have over that 5-year period. I think we're in a good position. Don't count chickens. Keep going. I would like to see us hit that 40% mark, and then I'll be a bit more confident, because I think that we just keep going. But what I can tell you, and being on the doorsteps, I have a number of across the new Holyrood constituencies, because obviously Glasgow politics getting split 4 ways, is that the Labour vote has collapsed. Some of it is going to reform. People who voted Labour last year, who were SNP before, are not staying in the Labour Party. Some of them are coming back. Some of them are going to reform. I think that there is... I still think Labour will be second, mainly because of their organisational strength and their financial strength, because they will throw a lot of money at this election. But the threat of reform being second is real, as that poll last week indicates. And that does worry me. And it worries me in Wales as well. I do think Plaid and Labour can lock out reform, because Plaid are going well at the moment. It might have to be the case that seeing these characters is what drives people away, as happened with UKIP in Wales. Because Neil Hamilton, you remember that trumpet? He was in the Welsh Senate, and the behaviour of him switched people off. That might be what has to happen. I hope it doesn't happen, because I really am concerned about some of the discourse that they'll bring into the Scottish Parliament on a whole range of issues. Because let's not forget, Reform would be quite happy to get rid of the Senate, and would be quite happy to get rid of the Scottish Parliament and to have everything at Whitehall. And I think that we should be paying particular attention to what Danny Kruger's saying about that, because that's the direction of travel.
Well, that's the campaign the SNP would be smart to run, is the anti-reform campaign. And I suppose the question is...
That's sort of what's... Cause, I mean, Chris mentioned about you drill down into the polling. I mean, I am going to be slightly partisan on this point. I mean, I don't think Labour's necessarily anywhere near where it's offering an alternative at this point on these issues. But I will say, it is remarkable to me that the SNP continue to be trusted on the NHS and education, because the standards in both have just fucking collapsed. I mean, I'm sorry. If anybody who thinks that education has improved in this country over the last couple of decades, they're living on a different planet. I mean, I just find that astounding.
So does it come back to what Chris just said about the weakness of opponents?
Well, two things have happened there. The SNP have been in power a long time, and what happens to governments in power a long time is they sort of start, they have to go through that process of renewal, and they have difficulty in coming up with new policies. It's always a challenge if you've been in power for a long time to come up with a new policy, because effectively you're saying your own policy didn't do the job, and that's a tension that's always occurs. That happens with every government and every political stripe that's been in power for a long time. But so you've got that going on, but also there's no alternative out there. I mean, Chris is absolutely spot. There's no opposition. There's no opposition to speak of. And by the way, I'm not as convinced as Chris is about Labour getting second place. Weirdly enough, because if people forget this, the official opposition in Scotland right now is the Tory party. It isn't Labour, right?
Yes.
And in places like Glasgow, Reform have effectively replaced the Tory party.
Mm.
I mean, the people have been moving across en masse, as well as them picking up all sorts of people, and also picking up people who haven't voted, which is worth noting.
That is worth noting, actually.
I don't think it's at all beyond the realms that the Reform are heading to second place. And actually, I understand perfectly well why it's perfectly logical for John Swinney, because you've been power for a long time, not a particularly exciting administration or leader, frankly. And so what you're going to do is you say, well, rally behind us, it'll stop Reform. I mean, that's what people do. I mean, I don't blame him for making that argument, because it's probably his strongest suit going into this election. But there has to be alternatives. There has to be alternatives at the very least to challenge him when he gets back into office.
We'll come to this.
No challenge.
We'll come to this question of alternatives. I want to touch on an issue which is very much linked to reform, and that's deindustrialisation. So when Lord Offord defected to reform just a couple of weeks ago, he did so less than a mile from the site of the Grangemouth oil refinery in Falkirk, which is itself just a few miles away from the site of Alexander Dennis, the bus manufacturer, which is also set to close, providing that there are not more orders found. It's currently on a Scottish Government-provided furlough scheme. The other side of the Forth, you have the most modern ethylene plant, 400 jobs set to go by virtue of Exxon Mobil's decision just up the coast. Again, the northeast, Aberdeen, you have Petrofac closing in 2,000 jobs going. These are all closures announced in the space of the last 12 months. So this is a new wave of deindustrialisation in the Scottish economy. Thousands of job losses cumulatively. And it is fueling reform, because what people see is that neither government has a grip on any of these cases. In the most modern instance, for example, Keir Starmer and his government ruled out any kind of intervention within 24 hours of Exxon's decision. The SNP promised a just transition plan for the site in 2024, and FOI requests for papers relating to that just transition plan return blank. This question is of particular relevance, I think, because it gets to the crux of the issue with reform, where there are the material consequences of governments who are not on top of their briefs.
Yes, but Farage and Offord were not in Falkirk because of Grangemouth. Let's be brutal about that. It's because there have been protests in a Falkirk hotel. So let's be clear about that.
But do you not think those protests are exacerbated by the neglect of the area personified by
Grangemouth? But there's not that many local people go to these things. It's the same in the Ascot, maybe started off with that, and then they had a look at some of the far right elements over there, and then step back and went, we're not having this. So it's just a complete... I think for some people, a vote for reform is a cry for help. Now, I don't understand that, but we have to acknowledge that that's the case. Because logically, you would think that's the last people who should be, those who would deregulate the economy even further, who are being funded with, billionaires. They aren't a mass movement that's people are dipping into their pockets and putting money in. That's just not happening. They'd have huge donation from some billionaires. So, and if you were to dip into their tax arrangements, it would make the Angela Rayner story look like nothing, frankly. And that might still make fit for Ajit Cropper, I think, because obviously there are some people who are digging away on that. It's a general sense of dissatisfaction and being completely and utterly cheesed off, and being pissed off. But there's I am concerned now that we have, particularly in the case of the UK government, giving INEOS money to go elsewhere in another country. I just think this is just completely and utterly bonkers, frankly. And, Ratcliffe, and all his time he's been involved in Grangemouth, has caused all sorts of, the first 3 letters of his surname describe him as, and beautifully, in my opinion. But I do think that, although we shouldn't conflate them, there's a real sense of what is going on industrially. Just transition to the public is just 2 words that we put together in the same sentence. It doesn't mean anything to them. It doesn't mean anything to the oil workers in Aberdeen, for example. It just doesn't. It's just 2 words in a sentence. There's no real sense that that's happening, which is comical, really. I mean, when I was at school, which, by the way, Coll, before you question, was mid to late 80s. When I was at that secondary school.
1880s.
No, 1980s, thank you. We were told oil was running out in the year 2000. And the referendum were told the oil was going to run out in 2020. And, we're still having these debates now. The Greens don't want us to do anything at all. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum, which is drill, baby, drill, which I think is the phrase. But, you have to look at all of this and have to manage it. But I'm really, really concerned that what's happening now, because of international factors, that we really need to start looking at what we're doing. And one of the things, incidentally, which I notice is an argument that's happening in Wales, is the Internal Market Act. It is a complete act of sabotage when it comes to some of this procurement. There's absolutely, there is no need for, forcing devolved administrations to look elsewhere for example, providing buses when you've got a bus manufacturer on your own doorstep.
Yep.
It's bonkers.
This is what I find quite interesting, though, about the SNP's response to a lot of these cases, particularly in the Northeast, is that it's not to point to the Internal Market Act or globalisation. The response of John Swinney is to say the reason we're losing jobs in the Northeast is because there's a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, which seems absurd. That to argue that higher taxes on oil producers in the North Sea is driving them
why John
away.
Pushes that line and why no one takes him on in that line is because
oil and gas UK are saying it.
The analysis was the windfall tax was, I think, 75 pence, and that was seen to be the maximum level in which you then say that's what you can get away with. The Labour government decided to increase that to, I think, 77, and that gives people the reasons for putting that particular position forward. My concern about the strongest argument that the oil and gas sector have about the windfall tax is they're the only ones subjected to it. I think that, again, going back to the plan,
Who else is making
Blair and Brown, first thing they did was windfall tax the private energy companies, and that'll fund your youth employment programme. It staggers me that they haven't reinvented the wheel in that particular issue, because the private energy companies, as far as I'm concerned, who are posting all these record profits, should be subjected to some sort of windfall tax and excess profit tax. Same with the supermarkets. Mm-hmm. Food inflation is what, 11, 12%? It's staggering that that's the case. And they're all posting record profits. Why are they no subjected to some sort of windfall tax that then try and put back into the economy? So we have to look at all of this in the round.
I think I thought that's quite. I have to say, Chris, I thought that an odd argument. So essentially, you're saying is Labour government moving this windfall tax to 77, or 77%, up from 75%, which it was as a temporary measure under.
Well, that's what the experts feel.
That's
the experts inverted commas.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. I mean, the experts. Guess what? The experts don't want North Sea oil big oil and gas to be taxed.
Yes.
This is a tax on profit.
Yes.
It's a tax on profit, right? It's not a tax on
not disagreeing.
turnover.
I'm explaining
It's a tax
the-
on profit,
I'm
and
explaining the position.
and these people have made. I mean, Shell in recent years is literally. In fact, they literally said it at their AGM. They have more cash than they know what to do with.
Yes.
Like these are not people we owe anything to.
Yes.
Right. So there's two things going on there. These people are making a mint, and we want to stop extracting oil and gas.
Yes.
Right. So I don't understand why anyone would be against a windfall tax. These and also the other thing, these companies, apart from us them not needing our sympathy with the billions they've got, are also they're behind some of the worst human rights abuses all over the planet and have been for decades. And I don't think well, I see workers' rights as human rights. But you know, all over the planet for decades, I don't think we owe them a dime to be
Not one for
a
a
dime,
as McCann said.
but I'll tell you something. I mean, there is an issue here about the workers and this concept of a just transition. I mean, it's absolute mince, and politicians. I have to say, SNP and Labour, and before that Tories and all the rest of it. And I have to say, all sorts of activists too, to some extent, although there's been movement, have never really fleshed out what that means. Now we had some really good work done. I think there was a really good paper done a wee while back for Friends of the Earth, I think, alongside trade unions, talking to people that work in the oil and gas industry about what a fair transition for them would actually look like, and actually trying to get them to the centre of what a plan could look like. That was a great first step. What I think is tragic is that when you look at situations like in Grangemouth, you know, there were SNP government ministers knew 5 years in advance where that was going, and not a light was cracked. You had, it's the same goes. I mean, UK government certainly doesn't get off the hook on that score either, and neither does the present UK government either. I mean, what's happened here is, I'm going to return back to my theme. I'm afraid it's turning into one. This is about governments not understanding they could do things and actually not wanting. It's almost like they're scared to demonstrate they can, right? I get that a devolved administration, you can't march in there and nationalise Grangemouth. I get that. I'm not completely delusional. I get that they can't necessarily march in and nationalise Bosmoran or any given number of other things. But what they can do is make the weather and make some of these things impossible cases to answer. And what they can do is actually come up with a credible plan. I mean, the Scottish Government's just transition plans that I've seen so far are just, I mean, I could have done it with a crayon in 10 minutes, to be honest with you. It's a farce, right? It's just window dressing, right? And I'm afraid in that score, they're every bit as bad as the UK government on this. I'm afraid that it's a plague in other houses. But the tragedy of this is they're both of them working together actually are perfectly capable of doing something about this, perfectly capable of providing a holding position for the workers while we move away from oil and gas and build something better, to build the production lines, to build the chains that are required to actually give ourselves a decent chance in the future. And it's not there. I mean, and I have to say, you look at Scotland as well. I mean, I had to say, I saw a party political broadcast. I think it was anyway. John Swinney, it might have been Stephen Flynn, but Stephen Flynn will be next up. Anyway, he's the next First Minister, isn't he? So talking about, this is Scotland's wind, just as 40, 50 years ago the cry was it's Scotland's oil. And I mean, the truth is, it's not Scotland's oil; it's multinational capital's oil. The truth is that it could have been Scotland's wind. A choice was made by the present Scottish government, right? The present Scottish government, that includes John Swinney and his predecessor Nicola Sturgeon. They made a positive decision to sell that to multinational capital again. Quite often the same companies, the very same companies, with all sorts of spurious excuses about we can't raise the capital. Of course, they could have raised the capital. Again, back to this lack of political will, lack of imagination, lack of willingness to demonstrate that governments can do things. They could have easily raised the capital if they were determined to do so. They didn't. What they did is they flogged it to the highest bidders. And when I say highest bidders, that's an extraordinary comment, given that all they raised was £750 million. That's what they sold it for. Right? Scotland's wind. Don't make me bloody laugh. And that's delivering nothing for anyone, right? So they've done nothing about the manufacturing to make this thing happen. Done nothing about the ownership of the bloody assets. The ownership of the assets is what matters. If you actually want... The big mistake that was made with North Sea oil is that we did not continue to own it.
Yes.
The big mistake that's being made right now with offshore wind is that we don't own it, right? Right? Why are we making... Everybody knows these... That's odd enough. The mistake with oil is a point that the SNP have made repeatedly and over and over the years. Fair enough. Quite right to make it. All sorts of sections are left of making that point. Why was the lesson not learned? Why did we just thought, that's been terrible for 40 years. Let's do it again now. Yeah. This is absurd, right? And all of it comes down to lack of bloody imagination, listening to your civil servants, not challenging a damn thing. What happened was with Scotland is they thought, we can't raise the billions required to build this stuff, so we'll just flog it. No, that's not. You think about how you don't listen to that. You can't, just because you can't raise it through conventional borrowing doesn't mean to say you can't raise it. You can raise it through bond issues. They could have stood together with the 32 local authorities across Scotland and raised bond issues. Local authorities have no limit on the borrowing capacity. You could have done all these things. They could have gone into partnership with other public bodies and raised the cash. They've done none of those things. They didn't even explore them. It's pathetic. And I know I've spent the last couple of minutes here, probably 3 hours, slagging off the Scottish government, but that utter lack of imagination is visible with the UK government's approach to renewables right now. Yes, they're putting up some cash, fair enough, and that's good. But they're putting up some cash at best to get going joint stock in these things. They should be, if this is important enough to provide for working people in this country, if this is important enough, and they keep telling us it is, it's important enough to save our planet, to save our workers' jobs, and to build a renewable economy. The government has to demonstrate how important it is. They think defending us against Putin is important enough to spend hundreds of billions of pounds on a weapons system they'll never use. Well, how about they've done the same in actually taking ownership of the means of production? Dare I say it? If you actually want to have control,
you can say it in
control
this
of your economy, if you want to have control over prices, then you have to be the generator. You can't be the person with the begging bowl and asking people nicely not to put the prices up. It's pathetic.
It is. No, not at all. I would like to use our final 10 minutes.
Apart from that,
Well, I thought it was 2.5 hours because Matt said final 3 hours and that was a half-hour contribution, which I greatly enjoyed, by the way. And I think just to say what's interesting about what Matt said about Scotland was that the successful leadership contender, Humza Yousaf, identified it as the government's biggest mistake this term, and I think he was right. Yeah. So in the final 2.5 hours, Coll, are we going to do an analysis of the Green Party and your analysis of the Green Party?
Well, we're going to...
And how delighted you are that there are going to be 17 MSPs?
We're going to talk about the rise of the Greens in England and Scotland and what's going on with your party, because in spite of the
That's not going to take 10 minutes.
In spite of the situation that Matt just described, the SNP are headed for another term of office, as we discussed earlier.
And it comes specifically because of that situation I've described, because everybody's preached this idea that governments don't do anything,
including them. They are practice to things that you've just outlined. But the Alternatives ascending to their left in Scotland at the moment are, as Chris mentioned, the Greens, who are predicted to win 17 seats, perhaps off the back of Zach Polanski's bounce south of the border.
Oh, it's no doubt about it.
And we shall see whether they stand.
No doubt about it.
But your party is the alternative option to the Greens if you're looking to use your ballot to the left. Let's start with the Scottish Greens, because I imagine both of you will have a similar answer. 17 seats is an impressive electoral feat. They've put members on. Why?
Well, I'm more interested in your analysis, Coll, to be honest, as I suspect Matt is as well. But anyway,
It's very mischievous.
This is very much a personal view. I do think they're riding on Polanski's coattails, and I think that sooner rather than later, before May, that may get found out. But I do think that there'll be an element of the left, and I think what's important about some of this is John Curtis had said before this poll came out, it was a couple of weeks before this poll came out, had actually identified that the Labour vote in Scotland isn't particularly left-wing, and is not working class, that their core vote is a middle class, social conservative type of people. So that means then that people in the working class communities who you would expect to be traditional Labour voters are thinking about going to the Greens. Either in constituency level, and I understand they're contesting constituencies and are certainly going to vote for them with their regional ballot. I don't like this 1-2, it's a lot of bollocks. There's 2 ballots, but it's not a 1-2, it's 2 crosses. So anyway, my view is that they're riding on Polanski's coattails, because Polanski is saying, and is talking a lot of sense in terms of his critique of the Westminster government and crucially of reform.
Yeah.
And I think that is what's driving some of that, particularly our young voters. What the Green Party's programme is will be fascinating, and where they end up, because some of us would not necessarily want to see them in government for the simple reason of more or less their behaviour in the lead up to the collapse. Now, I know Humza was blamed for that, but we couldn't have sat and allowed the Greens to discuss in newspapers for 28 days whether they should be in or out in government, and certainly couldn't have have allowed to sit there while Lorna Slater's on TV talking about what her options were and trying to get Labour into government, and that we would surrender all these things. This is just nonsense. You're a government minister. So I would suggest that that's the case. But what will be interesting for me is that who these Green candidates are, because I haven't really clocked this, because obviously in Glasgow in particular, you've had Green councillors who've now transferred to the Corbyn-led party, or as I said to the councillor for Govan when I saw him last week, to parody that Father Ted sketch, I hear you're a socialist now, Father.
Very good. Matt, what hope does that Corbyn-led party have? Has it been damaged detrimentally by what has unfolded over the last couple of months? Can it mount a comeback? 50,000 members is no insignificant feat. It makes it the largest socialist party in Britain of the post-war period.
For post-war period, do you think?
Without doubt.
Interesting.
Which war?
Of after the Second World War, I think that's probably fact.
Okay.
What are your party's prospects in Scotland, and I suppose more broadly?
Well, I think there's a. It looks like they're going to stand candidates firstly. On the lists, I should imagine. And I think this poses an interesting question for the Greens. The polling might be saying 17 seats for Union. I'm not sure how that works in practice, given the pool they're fishing in. And I'm not just talking about, will some of their vote drift towards your party or X. No, it's not just that. It's just how the list system works. Is that actually the people most likely to lose out to Reform, if Reform get a seat on a list, are the Tories, followed by Greens. That's just how the list system works. So I think I'm not totally convinced they're on course to get 17, but we'll see. It'll be certainly very interesting. Your party, I think, are going to stand candidates. I think they've got a fighting chance in constituencies like Glasgow and Edinburgh, I should think, on the lists. Their existence, we've spoken about this in previous. Their existence, I think, is a positive thing for socialism. And for those of us still languishing in the Labour Party, its existence at least gives the hope that it might actually, some arguments might make the light of day and might drag the Labour Party to some sort of common sense, maybe not common sense is the right word, but some sort of semi-rational position. Whereas in Scotland right now, it's just like, wrap yourself in a flag and hope for the best, as far as I can tell. It's the Dumbarton strategy, which is absurd. And what it's on course to do in terms of the Labour Party in Scotland is actually just carry on the trajectory. Of course, the Labour Party in Scotland have never gained a seat at a Holyrood election. Not once. I don't see that changing in the coming election. Now, all these things are interacting. And they're interacting partly because of the list system works. Labour's reliant on the list to get anybody in Parliament at all now, apart from obviously Jackie.
And Daniel Johnson.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, he is.
Yes.
Yeah,
That great bastion of socialism, Coll. Yeah.
well, you know, I mean,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
he does bestride the chamber like a colossus. But there is an issue how all that interacts, and some of that is actually hard to gauge, if we're honest. But I think the existence of your party is going to be a positive thing for the left. I think it's a useful thing for the left, whether you're inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party, inside the SNP or outside it. I think it's a useful thought. What I will say though is that your party have squandered massive goodwill. Now there was that initial idea, 800,000 people or so, I think, signed up initially for the mailing list. That's since translated into about 50,000 members. Now you were never going to get all that 800,000 going to membership, but what happened in between those two events is just blew the level of self-indulgence, just sheer self-indulgence that I've seen. And that people have, some people on social media like to pick a side, use Zara or Jeremy and all the rest of it. Well, I don't know Zara so well, but I know Jeremy a lot better. But I'll say I don't think either of them are coming out looking particularly good. I think people have just been massively self-indulgent. They've thought about their own positions and grandstanding rather than actually about how to build a movement. And I think in doing so, they've squandered what could have been a generational opportunity. And it's going to take a hell of a long time, I think, to make that party what it could have been, in my view, because of that farcical opening gambit. So I wish, in some respects, I wish your party all the best. I think its existence on the political stage is useful for any socialists. I suspect they might pick up a seat or two if they can run decent campaigns, and I think there are enough people who've joined it who can run decent campaigns, and they might benefit from the collapse elsewhere. But the reality of the situation is that SNP are going to win it. They may or may not get a majority. I suspect they'll be short of it. We'll have the Greens propping them up as they have done for the last decade or so. I lost count actually. Whether they're in a formal coalition or not, it doesn't matter. An informal. I never understood why the Greens joined the formal coalition. It's just utterly mindless thing to do.
Yes.
From their point of view.
From their point of view,
Chris raised the point about Lorna Slater talking about whether she could do a deal with Labour in the press. Do you know actually what she was doing? Was behaving. If only Green MSPs had behaved that way when they weren't in a coalition. They might have had more clout in the negotiations with the SNP, because one of the things that gave me a laugh every time the budget came round was they go into the budget and they negotiate really hard for a few weeks and then come out with exactly what the SNP were going to give them anyway. Yeah. Because they had absolutely no leverage whatsoever, because the people who are doing the negotiating have never faced an angry gaffer in their life. They don't understand how to negotiate, so they were going in there. And frankly, going, oh yeah, give us nice things. They'll go, yeah, all right, we'll give you these things, and then that's it. That's not a negotiation. You go in there saying you're going to give us this, or you don't get a budget, right? And that is they never played hardball. They never understood how to play hardball. And it might all be nice to pretend that Scottish Parliament's a nice wee cuddly place, but that kind of attitude, I'm afraid, doesn't get progress. We need debate. We need tension. We need the dialectic to move things forward. And if that isn't there, even at the heart of government within a particular party, never mind between parties, then you've got no hope at all. That's why one of the reasons we're in the absolute paralysis in government that we're in, and I suspect we're going to still be in at this time next year.
Chris,
apart from that's fine.
30 seconds to round off.
Aye, no chance. So, your party, it's going to create more interest and more intrigue in the newspapers, and it'll feed the beast that is the so-called mainstream media, because they're happy to have the left in this fight squandering and reform rising to the top, because that suits their agenda. And unfortunately, your party looks as if it's a scene from that wonderful stadium scene in The Life of Brian, about whether you're in the Judea People's Front, the People's Front of the Judea, or the boy who's standing on his own in the corner, who of course is the Judean Popular Front.
Chris has teed me up wonderfully for my note to finish by criticising the mainstream media, because before we close, I have to say thank you for all the support the podcast has received since our first episode with these two back in February. Unbelievable that following that episode anybody wanted to listen further, but they did. We wouldn't be able...
I can see another motion of censure coming here. Yeah?
We wouldn't be able to produce today's episode, or any other for that matter, without your help. Scotia launched Nest of Fearties because we believe there's a dearth of the kind of analysis this podcast seeks to offer in the Scottish media landscape, and we've got plans to expand our output next year, but to be blunt, that hinges on funding. So if you can afford to do so, please support us on Patreon. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks very much to Matt and to Chris for coming on.
Pleasure as always, comrade.
I'm sure you'll both be
Always a
back.
pleasure, never, sure.
See you soon.